Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on helping Native youth succeed through family and community engagement. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping notes. All lines have been muted. Your cameras are off. Event audio and video are also being recorded. To submit questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be read aloud. Next slide. In the event of technical issues, you may use a traditional conference line. The conference call number and webinar ID are listed for your reference. Please send technical questions in the chat. The chat feature is also at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. An ASL interpreter is present. Please be mindful when speaking that the interpreter is interpreting for our blind participants. Slides are Section 508 compliant. If you have not received a copy and wish to, please email info@oie-logistics.com. Again, that is info@oie-logistics.com. In addition, live captions are enabled for this webinar. Next slide, please. At this time, I will turn it over to Julian Guerrero, an enrolled citizen of the Comanche Nation and affiliated with the Kiowa tribe. Julian is the director for the Office of Indian Education. He will be moderating today's webinar. Julian?
Thank you, Mahogany. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. It is so good to join you all virtually this afternoon on such an important topic, such as helping Native youth succeed through family and community engagement. And albeit a very big topic, it is so incredibly important that our gathering virtual today is focused on the opportunities to really continue to dive deep into how we support our Native youth, their success through the lens of family and community engagement. I have with me many esteemed colleagues who I work with day in and day out, and throughout the Department of Education, as well as in other areas of the federal family. I'm excited for today's panelists, as well as today's overall dialogue. And it's so good to be with you all. And I serve as the director of the Office of Indian Education at the U.S. Department of Ed. And again, it's my pleasure to be here. So moving on with today's presentation, I want to introduce a good colleague of mine, Naomi Miguel. Ba'aga Neotham. Naomi most recently served as the staff director for the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States on the House Committee on Natural Resources at the United States House of Representatives. As staff director, she led an all-Native women staff and implemented the chair's legislative priorities for Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, including examining the policies and priorities of Indian education. Prior to this position, Director Miguel served as the legislative assistant for Representative Raul Grijalva, where she helped co-found the Congressional Native American Staff Association and hosted roundtable discussions about the importance of diversity and inclusion of Native American staffers in Congress. Director Miguel now serves as the executive director for the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans and strengthening tribal colleges and universities. Thank you so much for joining us, Naomi, and I now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Julian. I want to welcome all of you to this webinar on helping Native youth succeed through family and community engagement. And as most of you know, when we invest in Native students, our communities thrive. And at the Department of Education, we're currently reviewing our programs to ensure that federal funds reach Native American and Alaska Native students. Secretary Miguel Cardona is committed to being proactive and providing ongoing collaborations with tribal nations. As Executive Director for the White House Initiative, one of our many objectives includes increasing an understanding of systematic causes for educational challenges facing Native American students and ensuring that all Native American students have access to excellent teachers, school leaders, and other professionals by supporting the recruitment and retention of qualified teachers, school leaders, professionals, and other folks who understand Native American students' lived experiences. Most importantly, we want to support Native students with disabilities and ensure that they can also access gainful employment opportunities across tribal, federal, state, and the local workforce. I want to thank our speakers for joining us today and those of you who are viewing this. And I also want to thank all those who did the important work of putting this webinar together. I don't want to take up too much of the time because I do want to make sure that we have enough time to listen to those who are here to speak to us today. So thanks a lot. Back to you, Julian.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So moving down the line, I would now like to introduce Dr. Amy Lloyd, the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. Assistant Secretary Lloyd's career has focused on improving education and workforce outcomes for people and strengthening communities. She is of Zuni Pueblo descent from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Most recently, Dr. Lloyd was a vice president at the national nonprofit Jobs for the Future, where she led the organization's work in career and college pathways, workforce development, policy and diversity, equity and inclusion. Previously, she taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, was the director of education at the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, and has held many other roles in education, corrections, and reentry and public policy. And just real briefly, what is not on the script is that Dr. Lloyd is a dear friend of mine who I've known since she first got appointed at the agency. And we are all ecstatic that she's serving in such a position as this. We're happy to have you, Dr. Lloyd. Now, Assistant Secretary Lloyd, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julian, for the kind introduction. Keshe, buenos dias. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today. And today's webinar topic, Helping Native Youth Succeed Through Family and Community Engagement, is critically important and near and dear to my heart. And it's also a core priority for the Biden-Harris administration and for Secretary Cardona, as my colleague Naomi explained. We know our parents and our families are our young people's first and most important teachers. And while I have the honor of serving as Assistant Secretary in the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, one of my first roles in education was working as a family advocate for our Native students and families, working for a Native nonprofit organization in partnership with an urban school district. And so as a family advocate, I worked in partnership with and in service to our Native community to create culturally responsive and engaging opportunities for Native parents and families to share their voice and perspectives, to create space and advocate for their students' needs, to connect them with the supports and resources that help them to thrive, to lift up and celebrate their students together, and to build a shared sense of belonging and community connected to education. And my work then, and all of our work now at the department, is deeply grounded in our commitment to equity and to working in partnership with people to create opportunities through education and for learners of all ages to fulfill their endless potential. We know that we can and we must center the voices and the vision that our Native students and families and communities hold as we consider how our schools, how our services for students with disabilities are meeting our students' needs and how we support students to create meaningful pathways to bright futures. Just a few weeks ago, I joined Secretary Cardona in Oklahoma, where we visited we visited Riverside Indian School, and we also held a roundtable with Native parents and aunties and grandparents from across the greater Oklahoma City area to listen to their perspectives and to take what they share and use it to inform our federal policy and programs. And They spoke candidly about the needs of their students and the need to, encourage language revitalization and cultural learning while also providing mental health supports that's culturally sensitive, among many other things. And we take student, parent, family, and community engagement seriously because we know our work is all ultimately in service to you, to our communities. Secretary Cardona's met with over 10,000 parents so far, and we welcome and need this engagement. And that's why I'm so excited about today's conversation. We want education at all levels to be co-created in partnership with and in service to our Native students, Native families, and Native communities. And through education, we want to respect and support Native cultures, Native languages, Native values as assets in learning and in life. So we're here to listen, to learn, to incorporate what we learn into our work so that we can all help our Native youth succeed and lead our future generations to do the same. Alakwa, gracias, thank you, and back to you, Julian.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Lloyd. Could we get the next slide, please? So I wanted to spend a few moments just to talk about bringing the context into what today's session will be about. Some background history to this is that the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans and Strengthening Tribal Colleges and Universities, alongside the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Labor, has been hosting a virtual 4-part dialogue series that addresses multiple topics that impact employment for American Indians and Alaska Natives. The series first kicked off on November 1st with the event titled Mental Health Within Native Communities, a story of resilience, recovery, and employment. Next slide, please. To gain contextual awareness for the national educational statistics of 4th and 8th graders who identify as Native American students with disabilities is our focus in today's session, as well as to learn about the value of what it means to have community-driven solutions, particularly those that center around the empowerment and the empowering the role of Native American families as they care for their students with disabilities. Next slide, please. As well as to also cultivate a deeper understanding of community practices in order to help participants mitigate their own bias toward believing that best practices fit all Native communities. And then finally, to increase the visibility of Native American students who have disabilities. For our first presentation, we have with us Treva Roanhorse. I would like to introduce Treva as Treva is the former director of the Navajo Nation Office of Special Education and the former president of the Consortia of Administrators for Native American Rehabilitation, CANAR. Treva will provide us some national data and set the stage for us in her comments today. Treva, I now turn it over to you. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Julian. Yate Shea Treva Roanhorse in Shea Pushet Shinige ya Organization Training Jackie Ani Chedo Taban Chanel. Thank you for being here. Next slide. We're talking about helping Native youth succeed through families and community engagement, which is very critical and very, very important. In my presentation, I would like to share some data with you first, and then I will move into the other areas of why community engagement and families is critical in the success of youth with disabilities and also youth in general. Next. According to the data, there are under the 566 federally recognized tribes, there's approximately 644,000 American Indians and Alaska Native students who are in K through 12, and 90% of them are in the public school system with 8% in the Bureau of Indian Education. I'm sure there's going to be more because the programs under early intervention, pre-K, Head Start, and other programs where our babies are attending. Also, I looked at the estimated population in Arizona and New Mexico. because with being an advisor to the Sonora Center, these are the main hubs where these counties are where the main hubs of Native are residing. Next. And then the enrollment in Arizona public schools, Maricopa has the highest Native American population, plus on down, I'm not going to read all of it, but overall there's 17% of students with disabilities that are enrolled in the Arizona public school system. And then there are quite a few that are also attending Bureau of Indian Education. On top of that, there's also private schools, there's grant school, contract schools that are Native children are attending. Next. This is just a map that indicates where the reservations are, because we are charged with to address and meet with tribes across the state of Arizona. And there are 22 tribes that, you know, that we're working with, and that's going to be important to ensure that we get them involved, and get the families involved, and all the resource systems that are in place. Next. And in New Mexico, the neighboring state, there are 26 tribes. The main hub of the tribes are up in the northwest corner of the state. And these are individuals who are Native. There are public schools, the majority of them are in the public school system. Next. Family and community engagement. The student is a main hub. And to me, community is not only community, there are also, there's education, there's resources, there's support system. Nowadays, students with disabilities, they need a lot of that support in order for them to succeed in going through school and identifying what the resources are. Parents are also very important, that they need to understand that they have a voice. Also students, they need to understand that they have a voice on how because this is what they're going to be impacted with as they're going through the educational process. The culture, the language, the tradition, the way of life, you know, that's really key. And the community is not only the school, it's not only the families or the community or the families. It's the hospitals, all the other support services that are there, the hospitals and the different services that are available. It's important that they understand that. That's the reason why, you know, students need to also learn how to be advocates for themselves. Next. And the Find Their Way program under the Sonora Center with the University of Arizona, we looked at the different sections of what do we mean by finding their way, starting with early childhood, elementary, mid and junior high, high school, post-secondary. It's a circle of life. They're the, you know, finding their way. Where are they at in each step as they're going through from K all the way through the process of graduating from high school. When I used to work with the Office of Special Ed and Rehab Services, we receive a lot of referrals from high schools on transition for youth with disabilities. The majority of them, when they enter, they really are not clear on what they want to do after high school. All they're focused on is that they hope they graduate and move forward. But, you know, the plan after that is just finish high school, and then after that, some of them, they know what they need to do to transition either to post-secondary education, employment, or other areas that they want to pursue. So, you know, it's really important. When we had a call last month or 2 months ago, they talked about transition should occur even at the mid-school level. So as they're going through the process, when IEP meetings are happening with the parents, you know, it's important that, you know, they understand what it means about transition. That's really important. And I'm glad that Department of Education, Department of Interior, and the White House initiatives are coming together. Not only is it the community that have a role in this, the federal government, the state, They all have a role. The policymakers, they all have a role, because time and time again, we hear that our children, Native children, are not at grade level. What does that mean? Why is that happening? And, you know, it's always, you know, that's something that everybody seems that keeps coming out. So what is it that we really need to do to come together to address that so they are successful? My mother used to tell me, I'm going to go into my native language. So she always had that foresight of what she wanted for my brothers and sisters, that you're going to become a lady, you're going to become a man, you have to withstand heat, cold, everything. And then education, yes. But she always told us what the future, she always looked to the future for us. And I think that that's how parents feel. It's really important that we support our youth. And I'm glad that, you know, the major departments are coming together to address that. So it's a circle of life. Education is the focal point, but the other services, the support system, that's continuous. It's not, we can't separate it. So it's really important. Next. The support system, you know, resources, counseling, transportation, accessibility, traditional practitioners, culture, and language. Accessibility is also very important. Technical assistive devices, that might be something a student might need in their education. So, you know, sometimes I used to get calls from when there was a Navajo going to school up in Oregon or other states, and then they would say, this individual is a Navajo student, and they need this type of assistive device. Can the tribe provide that? And I tell them, well, if they're in special ed, you guys count the children in special education, then you should be able to provide that. So probably in some areas that device is not readily available to them. So they need to understand what's needed so they can be successful. The traditional practitioners also have a lot to offer, the culture and the language. That's really important. You know, that's who they are. That's you know, that's where they come from. So that needs to be something that needs to be infused into their teaching with the schools. The support system should always be available and accessible. You know, that's part of what they need. They can't just piecemealing the different services is not going to help the individual. And then the students, the parent, and the extended families, you know, that's also important, and that they're the ones that are raising the child. But then again, you know, as Hillary Clinton says, you know, it takes a village to raise a family or a child. So that's, you know, I agree with that. Next. And then the partnership, the successful implementation of cultural strategies for American Indian students, you know, that's another area of partnership that's important. The partnership should include, again, the parents, the extended families, tribal education, special education, vocational rehabilitation, workforce development, tribal colleges, state, federal, and local policy makers. Vocational rehabilitation is a very viable services in Indian country. Not all tribes have a vocational rehabilitation program. I believe there are 89 tribes in 26 states that have tribal VR. The states also have a vocational rehabilitation program, and 15% off the top is supposed to be allocated to the public schools. You know, if that's important to support students with disabilities. Also, tribal colleges, you know, they are an important role because that's one of the resources that they can access Workforce development is another resource that can provide the training that's needed for the students. So families need to understand what resources are there. The school need to understand what resources are there so they can, share that information during teacher-parent conference. It's important. So they have the resources that they know they can tap into for their children. And then, of course, finding their way to improve education opportunities. That's what we all want, encouraging them. And then we also need to grow our own of professions, teachers, doctors, PT, and all that. It's important. So I'm glad that we're addressing this, and that's what I have. Thank you, Shahad.
Thank you so much, Treva, for your comments today. Next slide, please. Another presenter that I look forward to hearing from in today's set of panelists is Mr. Jimmy Warren, a member of the Oglala Lakota. Jim Warren earned a bachelor's from Arizona State University and a master's from San Diego State University. Jim created continuing education programs at South Dakota State University Interwork Institute from 1993 to 2015. He has written over $50 million in grants and contracts for universities and tribal nations. Currently, Jim is the Community Engagement Director at the University of South Dakota Center for Disabilities, Oyate Circle Sanford School of Medicine, and an affiliate administrator with the Arizona College of Medicine, Sonoran Circle of Indigenous Empowerment. Mr. Warren, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you everybody for joining us. Well, is it still morning here? It is still morning. I'm in California, so greetings from the West Coast, and it's wonderful to have such a nice amount of participants joining us today discussing ideas and strategies for our future generations. And in this case, for our youth with disabilities in Indian country, as well as our Alaska Native villages up north in our Alaska region. There's a lot of Indian country. When you think of the umbrella of Indian country, there's so much involved and included, as Treva mentioned when she set the table for us. And before I go any further, I want to acknowledge Treva. I know she's on her way to a medical appointment, but she was one of my first mentors as a graduate out of San Diego State University. In 1993, I was sent to Navajo Nation to learn tribal voc rehab and OSERS, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, so that I would learn from one of the people that knows what they're doing in Indian country for disability services. So I was so very fortunate early in my career to have a mentor like Treva when I was beginning my career, working 22 years at San Diego State University. And I had thought I retired in 2015, but fortunately I crossed paths with Wendy, and she is the director of the Sonoran Center of Disabilities currently, but she was with University of South Dakota, where we created the Oyate Circle. And Oyate is my language, the Lakota language for the people. So I use circle a lot in my titles of my programs over the years because I believe in the power of the circle, as well as from a traditional standpoint, indigenous languages are more circular in format. So we tend to speak in a more circular format from an indigenous perspective, as well as we create partnerships. We utilize talking circles and things of that nature so that we can discuss issues and make plans and strategize for our future generations. Next slide, please. So here, sorry for the formatting a little bit here, but when you think of Indian country, that includes obviously our tribal nations. So years and years ago in the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Marshall identified Indian country as tribal nations, sovereign nations within the United States, working with the federal government in trust responsibility. And those trust responsibilities can be in forms of treaties, in forms of public law 280 tribes, could be with like our Alaska Native brothers and sisters, with corporations that they have in Alaska Villages status they have in Alaska. In Oklahoma, there's trust lands. So when you think of Indian country, it's not an easy definition, if you will, because there's so many different circumstances within these sovereign tribal nations in the United States. So here you see an image of a hoop dancer, and the hoop is indicative of Mother Earth, the circular philosophy, how we are living in our circle. Are we at the center of our circle? And these hoop dancers are very skilled athletes, I always say, as a former athlete, being able to do these things. But I kind of envision a hoop dancer is what we have to do, working with not only our federal government, but our states and other municipality governments that we are partnering with. So it varies per state. It's different. Some states enjoy a great partnership with their tribal nations. Other states have challenges. And that's what we try to work through. And then fortunately, with our federal status, we can kind of work around state barricades or barriers, if you will, if those come up, and bring in federal trust responsibility when we work with our Congress. So next slide. So here you kind of get a kind of a OD chart, organizational development chart. And within the US Constitution, and I have a copy of the Constitution behind me, reminds me I need to read it again. But when you look at the federal government and where Indian country fits in, under the Constitution, Indian country is mentioned 3 times within the Constitution. Primarily in commerce is the biggest impact for contemporary American relationships, with, when you think of the originalist Supreme Court members are looking at the originalist aspects of the Constitution. So I mention to my students often that 10% of Supreme Court cases impact Indian country directly. So it's very important that we are aware of what's happening in the judicial systems as sovereign nations, because we are always impacted with outcomes of some of these decisions, not only by the Supreme Court, but by Congress. So when you look at this dynamic here of Indian nations, you have the state government working with the federal government, as well as the tribal nations as sovereign tribal government. And I put the line here as kind of fractured between the tribal governments and state governments, because we tend to lock horns sometimes, if you will, in terms of working together. And as I said, it does vary state by state. And then when we have municipalities, counties and cities within Indian country, the reservation, the villages, the trust lands, those are some of the things that are always an issue that we deal with as tribal governments. And I hear a lot more of those things now because my wife is one of her tribal leaders for her tribe in Northern California, the Hupa tribe. And she's a tribal leader currently running for her tribal chairman. And so she's a natural leader. So we're hoping she wins next week in her election. So next slide, please. Here you see a visual of a map of the United States, and the green areas are the reservation communities. So 96% of the United States is now non-Indian land. So the 4% left is Indian country. So that is what you see here on the map. And there's a more a detailed map in Alaska showing the territories of the Alaska corporations and the villages that they have. But you see here on the map that Arizona region, the Four Corners area, Navajo Nation, where Triva is from, is the largest land-based reservation in the lower 48. And when you look at my area in the South Dakota region, you see other large land-based tribes. So these are tribes that are more rural and have access issues to services, particularly for disabilities. And then you see in Oklahoma, which just had a Supreme Court case impact the state of Oklahoma in terms of Indian country land designation. So you see that blue area is Indian country for Oklahoma. Next slide. So what are the value of community-driven solutions? What are these that we're discussing today when we think of community? In my language, it's Tioshpae. And so when we think of a community and an extended family from an indigenized approach, I've always tried to Indianize or indigenize curriculum or training so that it's appropriate as best I can for the tribal nation I'm working with. Now, there's no one way of doing this because I work in South Dakota with the Oyate Circle with my tribe primarily and our relative tribes. So our languages, traditional languages, we can understand each other. All of those tribes, the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. But in Arizona, it's a whole different dynamic. When you think of 22 tribes, some of which are multi-state tribes, like Navajo Nation has land in 4 states. And then when you think of Tohono O'odham in Arizona, that's down in southern Arizona, is some of their lands are down in Mexico. So it's a very unique issue when you think of sovereign tribal land base. It can mean multiple states and even multiple countries when you think of the southern and northern border. So when we are looking at the role of our extended families, our Native American culture, utilizing the talking circles and existing community groups that we try to tap into. We don't want to come in and say, here we are to fix everything. We want to kind of work with our community leaders, not only our traditional elected leadership, but our leaders in like our elder committees. We look at those traditional leaders from a cultural standpoint so that they are involved in our, many of our elder groups and our unchis, our grandmas, are really forward-thinking, multi-generational, as well as thinking of our young ones for future generations. So it's really good to get that elder input, like Triva is now, you know, she's an elder, and that's why we utilize her expertise, and she shares with us ideas and approaches to make sure we're doing it as best we can from a traditional standpoint. So disability awareness is a key issue culturally for Indian country because none of our languages, we still have about 200 languages left. So none of our languages have a word for disability. So that's why I named our youth transition program Finds Their Way, instead of transition for youth with disabilities, which is what it is from an English standpoint, if you will, but Finds Their Way from a traditional standpoint makes more sense for us as traditional indigenous people in terms of working with our young generations. So that's kind of an indigenized approach as well. So next slide, please. Excuse me. Here's the Oyate Circle that we're very proud of. So when Wendy was the director of the UCED, University Center for Disabilities, she invited me to create some grants and strategize and work together, and we created grants and contracts. And now we have a multitude of partners in South Dakota, as well as nationally, where the Oyate Circle has been making an impact in various capacities for the reservation communities, as well as our urban Indian communities in South Dakota and beyond, our neighboring states. As I said, many of our reservations are also neighboring states as well. So, but we've become national as a result. And it's wonderful to be able to share our story on a national scale, working with like Maternal and Child Health Region 8. We just did a year-long training contract with them, working with Head Start programs in Washington, D.C., the American Indian Office on the national level, as well as many of our partners we've developed in South Dakota that want to better serve Indian country. So it's wonderful to get people in the circle. As I say, I like the circle, and getting all of us in that circle so that we can combine our partnership to better serve Indian country. Next slide. Here is a map of South Dakota, and as you see here, there's some large land-based tribes. My home is Pine Ridge, and then we have, which is the Oglala, and then we have Rosebud, which is the Sicangu, and then Cheyenne River and Standing Rock, which has more of the different bands of the Oglala, of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. So all of us represent the Oceti Sakowin, which means the 7 council fires. So we are the nations of the 7 council fires, which in the US history books call us the Great Sioux Empire, or the Sioux Nation, the Great Sioux Nation. So that's all of us, the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota are called Sioux today. Next slide. And now we're very proud in Arizona that we just started, and with our indigenous initiatives, we were starting to create programs. When Wendy left South Dakota and she became the director in Arizona, she wanted to get something going similar to what we created in South Dakota. So I had the wonderful opportunity, because I was born and raised in Arizona. So that's an opportunity for me to come back to where I grew up, and I have a lot of friends in Indian country in Arizona. So it's wonderful to be going to the Apache country, which we were just at, and Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, all of the Akchin and, the old Pima and Papago tribes that are now Tohono O'odham, O'odham meaning the people, the desert people. So it's wonderful seeing my old friends and making new friends in Indian country in Arizona. And under the umbrella of Circle for Indigenous Empowerment is our, next slide please, is our Native Center that we're very proud of. This was one of our first fundings that we got. And we've been having great success with our webinars that started in Arizona. And then I started inviting our friends in South Dakota to join us. And now that has become a national webinar where we're getting friends and relatives that are out there serving our youth with disabilities from a variety of states nationwide. Next slide, please. Here's the Arizona Tribal Nations. As I said, it's very unique, the state of Arizona, with the multitude of tribal nations, as well as the land base. So 25% of the land is Indian country in Arizona. So when you think of serving Indian country, that is a great area of land geographically as well. Similar to South Dakota having a large land base, Arizona even has a larger land base of Indian country. And as I said, some of the unique aspects is the states that have, or the tribes, excuse me, that have multi-states. And then you see Tohono O'odham is on the border of Mexico, where a lot of the traditional people live on the other side of the river, way before American contact. So this is a unique aspect of working with the river tribes on the west coast of Arizona. And then way up north, you see Hopi and Navajo nations that are very large land-based tribes in the higher desert regions. And then the Apache country in the mountain areas, as well as high desert areas over there to the right, to the east of the state. And then, of course, Grand Canyon. We have tribes at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, as well as the top of the Grand Canyon. So when you think of outreach, you're talking significant mileage and a unique way to get to some of these tribes. Like getting to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, literally you can still take a donkey or a burro ride down to the bottom to get to the tribe down there at the bottom of the canyon. So it's a unique state. And then when you think of Phoenix and Tucson, and Flagstaff as well, they are cities that have high urban Indian populations. I'll use myself as an example. I was an urban Indian living in Phoenix, Arizona, that was from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. So that's a reality that many tribes, you'll have a multitude of urban Indians that we kind of call us as urban Indians from different tribal nations that may be from a different state. So that's another consideration when serving a diverse group of people. Next slide, please. So when you look at when we want to cultivate those deeper understanding of community practices, Treva really set the table well on a national scale, and what she has brought to the table as a leader in disability services. So how can we get our own biases out? So I always say that as Americans, we've all attended the John Wayne University of Indian Education. You know, that's kind of a joke that, you know, many people only know us through Hollywood or what they see on television, because when you think to your history of Indian education, what did you learn about Indian country from kindergarten through high school? What was the significance of the curriculum addressing Indian country? Did they talk about sovereignty? Did they talk about Indian nations within the Constitution? Did they bring up how we work as different nation-to-nation status, government-to-government status? These are all these issues that we as Native people live every day, but many people in America are not aware of as a result of the lack of, in my opinion, teaching the Indian 101, if you will, in American curriculum. So I'm hoping those things change as time continues. But as the last sentence here in my slide, I identify, why do we have the highest rate of disability in the United States out of any other culture? Out of all the cultures in the United States, why do we as Native people have the highest rate of disability? So during our question and answer, maybe we can discuss some of those issues. But a lot of that I've already brought up is due to some of the state governments that don't work as well with tribal nations. A lot of those state services don't get to Indian country. So the expectation is you better travel to us if you want these services. So again, it varies depending on the circumstance of that particular state or tribal nation. Next, please. So here's an image I like to share, is when people think of Indian country, they kind of homogenize us. So please, if there's one thing you take away, is that the diversity of Indian country is very unique. So you'll be providing services differently in Alaska than you would in New York, as you should, because there's a vast difference in diversity of tribal nations within those two geographical areas. But what Hollywood concentrates on, and I'm a filmmaker, so I always bring up Hollywood examples, but you know, Hollywood likes the Indian with a feather. So when you see the tribal members wearing feathers, that's what you generally see in Hollywood. So that's one of the challenges that we have. So should I stop there? Did I go over time as I usually do?
Yeah, it looks like we are out of time for you, Jimmy.
Okay.
But if you wanted, if there was a slide that you wanted to highlight before we transition, is there anything else?
Well, no, we can go from there. Just the diversity of Indian country, I think, is very important. But I did have a lot of information regarding historical trauma and boarding schools. I have a film out now. I guess I'll plug my film if you don't mind. Remember the Children, which my mom is a boarding school survivor at Pine Ridge Indian Boarding School in 1940s. and she shares her story of her experience in boarding school. And we're now finding many thousands of kids that were buried in unmarked graves with modern technology. And in Canada, they found thousands of unmarked graves, and the Pope was there last summer apologizing for the residential schools, but now they didn't mention America. So through our films and our teachings, we want to make sure those children are remembered. And again, that's something else that I think our curriculum should be addressing. It's not a comfortable thing, if you will, regarding that history of our kids, but it's still impacting our families today with that trauma and parenting skills and some of the challenges our youth are facing with disabilities today, not only themselves, but their family structure as well. So I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jimmy. And what was the name of the film again? We had a question.
Remember the Children.
Remember the Children.
Yes, we're at the Phoenix Film Festival next week. So we're in Colorado at the Durango Film Festival and won Audience Award. And so we've been getting some recognition, and people are surprised they're not aware of these stories of the boarding schools. There were over 400 in the United States. So many stories to be told.
Thank you, Jimmy. So, contractor, let's go to slide 49, please. And I do want to take a moment to introduce our next panelists for today's session, and that is Brookie Fixico Beasley, an enrolled member of the Muskogee Nation. Brookie Fixico Beasley is a third-year doctoral student at the University of Oklahoma in the special education program, focusing on post-secondary transition with American Indian and Alaska Native students and families. She has experience in teaching and coaching secondary students in the public school system and tribal schools as well. Her research focuses on empowering students, parents, families with culturally appropriate support and resources. Brookie, it's good to see you this afternoon, and the floor is now yours.
I first would like to thank Jillian Guerrero and everyone who took the initiative to bring these very important webinar series into fruition. The fostering of collaboration and knowledge sharing across our leaders and tribal communities is very detrimental when considering educational sovereignty and excellence for our Indigenous students. So with that being said, Hixjay Johodifkados, my name is Brookie Fixico Beasley. And we also, I just want to, before I start, also want to say that, you know what, as educators, as in just general education, we need to strive to do better by understanding the whole child perspective models with our American Indian and Alaska Native students and Native Hawaiian students. So I'm going to get started. And there's so much to unpack in special education, but today I am only going to cover the post-secondary transition piece of the IEP. However, I'm only touching the surface of each domains in the area due to time constraints. And I agree with Treva that college and career readiness should occur earlier than in high school. And so hopefully that is on the way of changing. Okay, next slide, please. And that's my title, individualized, and then the agenda. Okay. I'm going to go over IDEA 2004, post-secondary transition planning, and then entering a new journey, and then the IEP team and responsibilities. Next slide, please. Okay. So IDEA 2004 is basically free, appropriate public education that sets out a clear process for special education and related services to meet students' unique needs and to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And there are domains of IDEA and Individualized Education Plan, which is IEP. And let me say first that special education loves them some acronyms. And sometimes I have to use a cheat sheet sometimes. So we need to remember that when we are speaking with parents and students and families and communities. So the area and domains are the Individual Education Program, the IEP. And this is basically the roadmap of the student's whole educational program. And the domains are free, appropriate public education, which is FAPE, F-A-P-E. And then you have the least restrictive environment, LRE. Appropriate evaluations, which are the assessments, and I'm going to cover that. And then we also need to make sure, this is so important, that the student, parent, educators, school personnel, community participation. And then we have the procedural safeguards, which are important, along with the accommodations, modifications, assistive technologies, course of study, and aligned annual goals. Next slide, please. And so we have the transition plan process, and the areas that should be covered are your assessments, post-secondary goals, and coordinated services and activities. And the IDEA requirements, which I will name and eventually speak on each step. Next slide, please. So the post-secondary goals designed to be part of a results-oriented action plan that focuses on enhancing the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability in order to effectively help the child's transition from high school. Post-secondary goals are developed by the student and the IEP team. These goals will establish where a student will work, be educated or trained, and lived after completing high school. So our role as, like, I was an educator, the role of the IEP team, the whole IEP team, is to enable the student to meet their post-secondary goals. Next slide, please. So this is the coordinated activities area, and it includes education skills training beyond the secondary level, vocational training, integrated work, including supported employment, continuing and adult engagement in community activities. So some examples could be to tour post-secondary occupational training programs. They could also contact local college for disability documentation policies, tour career planning centers, and inquire to training programs available for them. And they could also meet with the disability coordinators and explain admission requirements and job shadow employment. There are many more. These are just a few of many activities. Next slide, please. So our next slide here, which is important, it's called the indicator requirements with IDEA. So you have graduation rates is indicator 1, indicator 2, dropout rates, indicator 13, transition plan compliance, and indicator 14, post-secondary outcomes. So the indicators are measures of compliance and effectiveness of a state's implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. So IDEA requires that each state to develop a state performance plan annual performance report. So these are reports that evaluates the state's efforts to implement the IDEA. The results of these indicators are reflected on the annual district determination profile, and districts are measured against targets which have been set by a group of stakeholders. So each one of these indicators are reviewed by the state. So let's talk about indicator 1 briefly. Indicator 1 is percent of youth with IEPs graduating from high school with a regular diploma. And right now in Oklahoma, we have just your general diploma, but it is talk, and I don't know about getting an alternative diploma. And that's for, they're wanting to use that for students with more significant disabilities. So indicator 2 is percent of youth with IEPs dropping out of high school. So that has to be reported too. And then indicator 13 is percent of youth age 16 and above with an IEP that includes coordinated, measurable, annual IEP goals and transition services that will enable the student to meet the post-secondary goals. And indicator 14 is the percent of youth who had IEPs are no longer in secondary school and who have been competitively employed and enrolled in some type of post-secondary school or both within 1 year of leaving high school. Then a post-secondary school survey will be conducted via phone, and then they are contacted 1 year after post-graduation. And that is done by a special education personnel. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I moved back to assessments because to me, this is the part of the, and not just me, but this is the piece that basically drives the IEP. So a collection of assessments in the 3 areas of education, employment, and independent living. And there is one specific geared toward American Indian Alaska Natives. But the purpose of transition assessments and results generally leads to the overall goals to gain information that will guide the decisions made for the entire transition plan. So collecting data on student strengths, preferences, interests, career-related needs, summarizing data that support students measuring post-secondary goals. And then, so the strengths could be what they are good at doing, preferences, how they learn the best, what they choose, and interest, what they like to do, and needs, what transition skills they need to be taught, and they will become the annual transition goals. So it is mandated the state of Oklahoma that we're required to provide a minimum 2 or more assessments annually, and at least 1 should be a formal assessment, which has validity and is evidence-based. And there are many more out there and can be purchased, and some are actually free. Next slide, please. Okay, American Indian Alaska Native culturally relevant appropriate assessments. Well, out of all these, I believe there's over 1,000 assessments for transition. There is only one that is geared towards the American Indian Alaska Native populations, and that is called Casey Life Skills, and that's an informal transition. However, the tag, which is housed under the Zaro Center, is currently being developed by a fellow cohort, and she is a Cherokee citizen. And she is basically transforming and reconstructing the tag to be more culturally relevant and responsive to Indigenous students. So I'm looking forward to that. And so I hope everyone out there that does work with students and assessments, keep an eye out for that, because that'll be coming hopefully within a year. And so both of the assessments are available on the Zaro Institute webpage, which I have placed a QR code on the last slide. Okay. Next slide, please. Hope I'm doing okay on time. There's so much. Okay, so students and family-centered planning. The student and families are in the middle and supports are surrounding them, which that's how it should be. Next slide, please. Okay, so the whole students and families should be center of planning. The team should apply critical resources to support robust transition plans and to empower the students and their families. And you can see who is in the center of the chart and diagram and who surrounds the student and families. An example of who should be in the IEP, post-secondary transition planning. And as Treva spoke on tribal vocation rehabilitation programs earlier and the importance they can help to support the student and families. And I know in Oklahoma, there are 5 VR programs that house transition programs underneath them. And so those are very important. And the hope and the goal is to get more within the tribal programs. So if you look at the diagram, we have administrators, special education teachers, transition coordinator, your school counselor and school psychologist, Teachers, coaches, band directors, I always would invite, if my students were in some type of extracurricular activity, I made sure I invited the coaches, or the coaches knew or had an idea that that student was on an IEP. And sometimes those are the most supportive people that they have for them. And then you have your VOTEC, if students are attending VOTEC, their VOTEC teachers, also employers, if your students are working, the employers should be at those IEP meetings. And then Indian Education Advisor, director in the public schools, and or JOM specialist, they should also be able to attend meetings and help support and advocate for the students and families. Tribal VR, interagency community programs, and tribal education advocates. And that is a goal too, that tribal education has more advocates for students with disabilities and their families to also go into the schools and advocate for them, and to also attend IEP meetings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so if there isn't an adequate IEP, post-secondary transition plan, they may directly violate the right to a free and appropriate education, which is FAPE. So they may be in violation if all the areas are not covered. Next slide, please. And I just want to say before I move on to this slide, sometimes we are quick to speak at students and families, but we need to listen and hear their voices and hear what they want and what they need and their needs. So this slide right here is a transfer of rights that automatically occur on the student's 18th birthday when they turn 18. So what does this mean? And guardianship. So at the age of majority is 18. And in order to prepare students and parents for the transfer of rights, the law requires schools to inform all children with disabilities before their 17th birthday that their certain rights will automatically transfer to them. And so they do need these early alert notices, because they need enough time to consider whether or not the child is capable of making informed decisions at the age of majority. So in some cases, parents or guardians may determine it is necessary to have their child declared legally incompetent and placed under guardianship. So the court-assigned guardian can make the decisions for the students. So it needs to be known that guardianship requires court intervention, and it is expensive and it could be a lengthy process. And finally, next slide, please. Before that student leaves high school, it is so important that those parents or guardians take with them, when they exit, an updated IEP in place by graduating and aging out. Because when they go off to college or VOTEC or whatever they need an updated IEP, because they'll want to see those. They'll want to see the IEP, they'll want to see the assessments. So that needs to be expressed.
And Brookie,
Yes.
it looks like we are at time, unfortunately,
At
but
time.
I know you have
Right.
I know you have a student who you'd like to introduce.
Yes, yes,
Contractor, let's please have slide 67. And Brookie, I'll let you give Newell a moment to say hello.
Okay. So I'd like to introduce the next presenter, Newell Nelson, and he is a member of the Cherokee Nation. Newell is currently a senior at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, and he is getting a double major in wildland firefighting and parks and recreation into law enforcement. Newell, would you like to speak?
Yes, ma'am. Hey, I'm having a good time listening to all the speakers, and I'm looking forward to speaking for y'all.
Okay, and I have a few questions to ask Newell, and then he can, if there's anything else he'd like to share, and he's going to be able to do that. Okay, Newell, the first question. Newell, can you tell us what the earliest grade you can remember receiving special education services, and maybe elaborate on it?
I attended Frontier Elementary School, which is located on the Otoe, Missouri Reservation, and it has 75% Native American. As a preschooler, I received speech language services for Aprixia. I had an understanding of the language, but I could not express what I wanted to say. I can remember the speech room and listening to the tones through the headphones. I must have been a miracle child because I was released from speech services in the 1st or 2nd grade. Now I can express myself verbally as well as my peers.
Okay, thank you. Noel, do you feel like you had the most appropriate education throughout K through 12 grades?
I don't think I had the most appropriate education in grades 3 through 5th. The students who look more native than me and myself should have been more academic support and kindness and encouragement.
Okay. And the last question, do you currently receive accommodations in college? And if so, what was the process to get them? And are your professors very supportive? And do you find colleges accommodating students with disabilities?
I found both Northern Oklahoma College and Southwestern Oklahoma State College accommodated students with learning disabilities. The instructors would put a message on the syllabus to students with disabilities that reads, "If any member of the class feels that he or she has a learning disability and needs special accommodations, the instructor will work with you and student services to provide reasonable accommodations that will help ensure that you have an equal opportunity to perform in the class. Please advise the instructor of such disability and the desired accommodations at some point during or immediately after the first scheduled class."
Okay, thank you. All right, and those are all the questions I have for you, Noel. Is there anything else you would like to share before we move on to the next presenter?
No, ma'am, I appreciate everybody letting me speak and being a part of the webinar.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Julian, back to you.
Newell, Bricky, thank you both for your comments today. We surely appreciate all that you're bringing to the table for us. Let's go ahead and get the next slide. So I'd like to introduce Anya Carrillo. Anya, who was born and raised in Arizona, she is an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Laguna and is equally proud of her Hopi, Lakota, and Seneca ancestries. Anya is the mom of 3 beautiful children, Judah, Marceline, and Soraya. Anya is an experienced self-advocate, a skilled peer navigator, and an accomplished trainer, presenter, and person-centered planning facilitator who is conscientious about listening to how others need support. She is the 2017 recipient of the National Advocates in Disability Award and the 2019 recipient of the Marcus Harrison Jr. Leadership Award. Anya is the peer-based service professional at Diverse Ability Incorporated and serves as a youth engagement coordinator for the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities. Anya, the floor is now yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me speak today. A voice is something everybody wants. Knowing who you are and what you want or what you need is an important part of growing up. I am one of the many youth who have never understood or realized that my voice was important. I didn't know I was allowed to have a say in my IEP. I didn't know that because of my diagnosis, leaving my AP and honors classes wasn't something I had to do. I didn't know that everyone else was speaking on my behalf and that they were the ones planning what they thought was best for me. I was able to join a youth leadership forum in 2014 when I realized that I did have a voice and was able to speak to the teachers and my mom about my needs and wants. I extended my high school senior year to do what I needed and what I wanted for my success. I re-enrolled in honors classes and succeeded. I joined many extracurricular activities and succeeded. I engaged in the disability community and started speaking about advocacy. I was awarded the 2017 Advocates in Disability Award and started fighting for the youth in the Native communities to have the same outcome I was able to have. I am still working to help support youth who have disabilities to understand that their voice is important and that they are important. One thing I have noticed is that Native youth are afraid to speak up because of the idea of having to respect elders. The thing they don't realize is that you can still respect elders and speak up about their needs and wants. So how do you engage youth who are afraid of speaking up in fear that they will be disrespectful? I was able to give youth the understanding that if they ask for guidance and help in understanding who they are not disrespecting their elders, but engaging the voice of someone who had to do the same thing at their age. Because I spoke up and used my voice, I am here today. Because I used my voice, I am teaching other youth and young adults to do the same. I am now on 6 different committees that all have to do with youth and young adults who have disabilities. My voice is being heard. I am a peer-based service professional and the head of multiple youth and peer-based initiatives at Diversability Incorporated. And I'm the youth engagement coordinator for the Sonoran Youth Ed. I am successful and happy. I have a voice that has been projected in so many different states. So if you could give youth and young adults who have disabilities the same opportunity, wouldn't you want to? That is why I fight so hard for the youth's voice, because without that, I would not be here today to speak on something that I know is so important. Thank you guys for your time. I cut it down a little short because we are running out of time. But I really appreciate you guys coming today. Thank you.
Anya, thank you so much. And you actually gave time back for more question and answer opportunities, and we truly appreciate that. So before we move to the question and answer, contractor, let's get the next slide. And I just again want to uplift and highlight and thank with utmost gratitude our presenters today, Treva, Jimmy, Brookie, Newell, and Anya. We appreciate the time and consideration and giving us your story and your passion in these comments today. It really helps set the stage and contextualize again why it's so important to be talking about this topic. That being said, I'm going to turn it back to Mahogany, our contractor on task for this session, to help us go through any questions and answers. So at this moment, I'll give it back to you, Mahogany.
Hi, Julian. Yes, we have 4 questions that were not answered in the chat. The first question is from an anonymous person. For those states who do not work with their tribal nations, what suggestion to support in working together? Is it relationship building or something else? What can people not in government do to assist?
Shall I take that, Julian? Is that?
Please. Yeah, Jimmy, thank you.
Yeah, and yes, thank you for that question. And this is always the first step. That's always the hardest step to take. So in terms of that, if you don't have that connection to government, there are many events in Indian country that are festivals or celebrations, powwows and different things of that nature. And for instance, in South Dakota, we always have tables for disability services at the Lakota Nation Invitational, which started as one of the largest basketball invitationals in Indian country, but has grown into something much more than athletics. There's culture, there's language bowls, there's a variety of things to attend. So if you start having tables at these types of events where the Indians are, I always like to say, find out where the Indians are and then go set up a table to share your information. And then it might not happen that first time, but people start seeing you at these events, health fairs or whatever it might be. And then they start seeing, okay, this person's interested in us. Let's check them out. So that would be my suggestion. Anyone else on the panel?
Are we ready for the next question, Julian?
I think so. Let's go ahead and do the next question, please.
Okay. The next question is from Robin Hickey. Is it possible to homogenize some of the physical infrastructure aspects of Indian education rather than the cultural?
I tried to answer a bit in the chat, or maybe I did it wrong. I'm not sure. But there is some generalized, homogenized approach to disability, But we got to remember, as diverse as Indian country is, so is our disability community. So when we think of disabilities, many people only think of a wheelchair or deafness or blindness, but there's so many other aspects of disability that many people do not see. So it's really difficult to homogenize in terms of, because I always say, we can't homogenize Indian culture. Similar with the disability culture, it's very difficult to homogenize that. Yet there are similarities from an indigenous approach that you can utilize, as well as you identify that there's very many different approaches, as you would with disability services that may differ per community. So I hope I helped to answer that infrastructure question, because that's very important to have a stable infrastructure so those services are consistent for our young ones in particular.
Thank you, Jimmy. Any other panelists, would you like to chime in? Okay, hearing none. Mahogany, let's get the next question, please.
Next question is from Shannon O'Neill. Could American Indian authored books that are recommended be shared with us?
That's a great question, and I believe panelists, you're welcome to kind of throw that in the chat. Is there any panelists who would like to kind of maybe recite a few books off mind?
A couple that I always like is, first of all, try to find a native author, first of all, because no matter what, I would do the best I could writing about another culture, but I would always have the lens of a Lakota man. So again, that would be always the root of my perspectives and writings. That's what we all have as writers. So something that I would suggest is finding those authors from Indian country and the books that are available in your area that address the tribes that you're working with. So of course, a big one that Neihart wrote was with Black Elk Speaks back home. Native didn't write it, but at least it was translated as best they could. They got some of it wrong from Black Elk directly. And then Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, again, it was non-Indian authored, but was good in terms of telling some of those stories of Indian country from South Dakota. And The Wind Won't Know My Name, I believe it is, regarding, I believe, Hopi tribe, regarding some of the land issues. There's so many books and now documentaries out there. It's wonderful to have a platform where there's more of us as Indian people sharing our stories, not only as authors, but as filmmakers and educators and service providers. So it's wonderful to be here as an elder in training, I like to say, to see so many young ones, you know, in the world of education and supporting our disabilities. So those would be some of my suggestions. Anyone else?
Would we like to move to the next question, Julia?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get the next question, Mahogany.
Okay, from Anonymous, what programs have you seen that do transitions well or are model programs for others to learn from?
Any of the panelists interested?
I can say a couple of those.
Sure.
I believe the Iowa tribe, they have their VR program houses the transition. They have a transition specialist in their program, and she advocates for the students, and she does go out into the schools and attends the IEPs. And also the Chickasaw Nation have a transition specialist who is a former special ed teacher. And she's been doing that for about 5 years. So she also goes out into the schools and advocates for the families in schools. And those are two that I know of right offhand. And I believe that, like I said, the VR programs are starting to include transition within their programs.
I would also, because there's a variety of tribal VR programs in Oklahoma in this case, they do have a pretty good relationship with the state. So you can identify getting services not only from tribal VR, but the state as well, that generally has more resources available through their system. So Oklahoma is an example of a state that works pretty good with their travel VR programs. Back when I was working with them years ago, so I would imagine it hasn't changed. I hope so.
Yes, they really do. And
Okay.
there's a piece where, you know, some don't understand that it's also state and VR programs can also work together for the student or services. Thank you, Jim.
A lot of states also have something called a youth leadership forum that is for youth and young adults who have disabilities. In Arizona, we are branching off to tribal communities and having this youth leadership forum. Sorry, I have my kids home right now, so they are making a little bit of noise in the background. But I would recommend looking into seeing if your state does have a youth leadership forum, because they do provide those transition supports as well as resources. Now that Arizona is kind of guiding its way into Native communities, and with the help with Find Your Way program, it's really awesome to be able to have this. And that's where I learned how to use my voice and how to do what it is that I needed to do in order to, you know, advocate for myself and get the resources that I needed. So definitely something I'd love to plug in is the Youth Leadership Forum.
Great, thank you. And why don't we get one last question, Mahogany, and then we'll go ahead and move to closing comments.
Okay, this question is, I believe, a comment from the question that Jimmy answered. Wouldn't homogenizing be against the purposes of the IEP? IEPs must stress the individual needs of the student in their particular tribal community and school. Isn't that right? And that's from Carlotta Bird.
Yes, and that's why I indicated that there are some generalities, not only from a Native cultural indigenous perspective, but generalities from a disability perspective. But we cannot, by any means, homogenize either of these communities because of the great diversity within Indian country, as well as our diversity within disability. For instance, I do this work in honor of my father, who had MS for 37 years. And there were significant disabilities that went through time with him. And as a kid, I was an advocate before I even knew what the term advocate meant, because I was the older son sent to the kitchen that would say things need to be moved so dad's going to eat in this restaurant, regardless if you want people in wheelchairs here or not. But those experiences are different from a mental health perspective, from behavioral health, from disabilities within the dependency community as well. So again, homogenization, I always say, use as generalities, but make sure you focus on the specifics of that particular cultural nuance within the general culture of either Indian country or disability. So I hope I answered that.
And Julian, if we have time for one last question, we did get another question in.
Okay, sure. Let's do one more and then we'll close out.
Okay. Okay, from Anonymous. How can state and federal government departments or offices best reach out to tribes and form partnerships with tribal leaders?
Well, that's a great question, because many state governments have tribal liaison positions. That's what I would first look. What do you have within your state government? Is there a tribal liaison? And these individuals really have a lot on their plate, because it's usually their one Indian in the state government as that liaison. So they have to liaison with everything in Indian country, from agriculture to disability to environment to water rights, whatever it might be. These liaisons have to be aware of all this in Indian country. And also there's a lot of Indian like tribal voc rehab conferences and gatherings. Someone put the AirTech on there as well, AverTech, as a resource. So there's groups of tribal specific programs in either voc rehab or special ed or other areas that you can access. And before I forget, I wore this medicine bag today for my presentation in honor of a young man back home in Pine Ridge that gave this to me 20 years ago. after one of my football camps, and I've never given it up. It has many special things in it over the years, but just in his honor, I wanted to wear this. So I had his energy with me, because there's so many challenges back home. We have over 300 suicide attempts with our youth alone every year at Pine Ridge. So again, there's so many challenges with our young ones. I'm just so glad that all of us are here trying to put our heads together so that we can do something for our future generations. So thank you to this young man for this medicine bag that I've had for many years. So Palamia.
Jim, I just want to go off of that and say that mental health awareness is very important, and that also is under the special education services and or 504 services. So I feel like parents and families and educators need to know that. So.
Thank you so much, Mahogany. Again, all panelists and presenters, and especially thank you to our sign language interpreters, both Ruby and Lisa. Thank you for all that you're doing for us in today's conversations. With that being said, could I get the next slide? Please stay in contact with us. Our website is ed.gov, but we'll continue to push out additional information as well as what the next virtual sessions in the series will look like. Again, we appreciate your time and attention today, and to all, safe travels to you, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.